I still remember the color before anything else. That shade of orange. A violent, burning hue that didn't belong on the front door of a home I had poured years of my life into. It screamed at me before I even read the words, like a flare fired in broad daylight, announcing to the entire neighborhood that I had failed. The notice was stapled crookedly, the corners curled from the late afternoon sun. At first I thought it was some kind of flyer, maybe a roofer's advertisement or a lawn service coupon, but the bold black block letters at the top froze me in place. Violation. Unsafe conditions. My keys slipped in my hand. The metal scraped against the lock before I managed to twist it. I just stood there, reading and rereading, my eyes snagging on each bullet point like barbed wire. Fence posts rotting, creating hazard. Weeds encroaching on sidewalk. Exterior garage paint peeling. Immediate remediation required. And then, at the bottom, in letters slightly smaller but far heavier in weight, failure to comply within 30 days may result in fines up to $500 per incident. I pressed the paper flat against the door, my fingertips brushing the wood beneath, as if the grain could tell me whether this was real. The garage. I'd been repainting it slowly, section by section, in the evenings after work. The weeds? I pulled them every Saturday, knees in the dirt, sweat dripping into my eyes. And the fence. Yes, the fence had some splintered boards, but rotting? Unsafe? It had been standing for 15 years without incident. Still, there it was. A list of accusations against me, against the home I had clung to through divorce, loneliness, and nights where the silence itself threatened to smother me. A car rolled by on the street. I caught the driver's glance, quick, dismissive, before he turned his eyes forward again. For the first time, I felt exposed on my own pores. Like my house wasn't shelter anymore, but a glass box for the whole neighborhood to peer into. I tore the notice down and carried it inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of the coffee I had left in the pot that morning. I tossed the notice onto the table, but it didn't just sit there. It loomed. A splash of garish orange against the calm beige of the room, demanding my attention like a wound you can't ignore. I tried to eat dinner, but every bite turned to chalk. I tried to watch television, but the voices blurred into static. My eyes kept flicking toward the paper, like it might sprout new accusations if I looked away for too long. By the time the sun dipped below the roofs outside, my chest felt tight. I opened the window, hoping the cool air might loosen something inside me. That's when I heard it. Laughter. It drifted across the street, carried by the stillness of the evening. I leaned against the frame, narrowing my eyes. On his porch, Daniel sat with two other men, a glass of amber whiskey catching the last slant of sunlight. He was a tall man with shoulders that seemed to crowd the space around him. Even his laugh had a kind of arrogance, sharp, deliberate, like he wanted it heard. "Some people," he said, his voice carrying far too easily, "shouldn't own property if they can't afford to keep it up." The men chuckled, and one of them added something I couldn't catch. Daniel's laugh came again, louder this time. He sipped his drink, gesturing vaguely toward my side of the street. Heat rushed to my face. My hands curled into fists at the windowsill. It wasn't just a violation notice anymore. It was a weapon. And Daniel, my neighbor, the man who used to borrow my ladder and complain about his bad back, was swinging it like a blade. I closed the window quietly, though my heart hammered so loud I thought they might hear it anyway. Back in the kitchen, I sat at the table. The notice lay there still, flat and lifeless, but its words echoed in my mind. My house, unsafe. My efforts, inadequate. My manhood, questioned. I thought about the years I had spent clawing my way back to something resembling stability. Every paycheck trimmed of luxuries so I could fix one more thing, buy one more gallon of paint, replace one more broken shingle. My house wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It was proof that I hadn't been defeated entirely by the divorce, by the loneliness, by the nights where I sat staring at a silent phone. And now, With one piece of paper, Daniel had stripped it bare. He had turned my home into a stage for humiliation. I sat in the dark for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street. I turned the notice over and over in my hands, the edges crinkling, the orange smudging faintly onto my fingers. Finally, I set it down flat. My reflection caught in the darkened kitchen window behind it. A man hunched, shoulders bent, eyes shadowed. Why would he do this? I whispered to no one. The paper didn't answer. It just glowed faintly in the dim light, a silent reminder that the walls around me, the place I called safe, had already begun to crack. It wasn't always like this. When I first signed the papers and carried the keys in my palm like a sacred object, this house meant salvation. It had been 2 years since my marriage collapsed. 2 years since the ring I wore had felt more like a shackle than a promise. Divorce has a way of gutting you silently, like water eroding stone. One day you think you're a husband, a provider, a man with a future. The next, you're sleeping on a friend's couch with a duffel bag of clothes and a stack of legal envelopes that smell faintly of her perfume because you packed them too fast. I worked through it. I had to. Every hour of overtime, every weekend shift, it was all fuel for one singular goal, a house. Not just any house, my house. A place where silence wouldn't mock me but restore me. A place where I could paint the walls with my own hands, choose the furniture without compromise, let the smell of my cologne linger on the closet air without it being drowned out by someone else's. The day I moved in, I remember pressing my palm flat against the fence in the backyard. It was rough, splintered in places, but solid. That fence became a symbol to me, a boundary that was mine to protect. And in those first months, I felt hopeful. That's when I met Daniel. He was the kind of neighbor who arrived before you could even unload the moving truck. Broad smile, firm handshake, a confidence that came off almost as charm. He brought over a 6-pack of beer and a story about how he'd nearly thrown his back out hauling gravel the week before. I liked him. In fact, in those early days, I thought I was lucky to have him across the street. We had barbecues that first summer. I still recall the smoky tang of ribs on the grill, the sound of our laughter echoing down the cul-de-sac. He'd talk about his own divorce, how his ex-wife had taken more than her share, how he'd bounced back by working the system instead of letting it work you. I laughed then, not realizing there was truth tucked in those words. He borrowed my ladder. I borrowed his drill. We even talked late into the night once, sitting on his porch, both of us nursing beers. I confessed how empty the house felt sometimes, how I left the television on just to fill the silence. He nodded knowingly, offered a kind of brotherhood I hadn't felt since college. But time has a way of peeling the varnish off people. The first red flag was small, a comment about my car. I'd bought an older sedan, reliable but modest, the kind you drive when you're rebuilding your life brick by brick. Daniel smirked when he saw it. Hey, practical? That's good. I mean, some people like to show off, but you... He patted the size. He hood like it was a wounded animal. You're sensible. Nothing wrong with that. It stung, though I brushed it off. Then came the remark about my lawn, how the grass was a little patchy compared to the rest of the block. Then about the paint on my shutters. Then the loose brick near the walkway, always said with a laugh, always dressed as advice. I told myself it was just neighborly ribbing. We men, after all, are trained to take the jab, to swallow the sting, but each remark lodged itself somewhere quiet inside me, where it festered. Then there was the HOA. When I first moved in, the board seemed like background noise, a handful of retirees and busybodies who handed out newsletters about community events and holiday decorations. But Daniel had influence there. At meetings, his voice carried more than anyone else's. I went once, early on. sat in the back, arms folded, listening. They talked about preserving property values and maintaining community standards. Harmless enough words, but every time Daniel spoke, there was an undercurrent of accusation, as if he was reminding us that our homes weren't just ours, but his to judge. He was magnetic in that way. People nodded when he spoke, even if their eyes said otherwise. I noticed that, but I didn't speak up. I never did. Silence became my habit. When the first small notice came in the mail, a reminder to edge my lawn more frequently, I complied without protest. When Daniel suggested a local painter, his guy, who could repaint my shutters for a steep fee, I declined politely and did it myself. And when I overheard him one afternoon telling another neighbor that some folks don't really understand what it takes to own property, I let the words hang there, unchallenged, like humidity in the air. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. After all, hadn't I come here for peace? Hadn't I promised myself this house would be my anchor, not another battlefield? But peace, I've learned, is never won by silence. It's bartered away piece by piece, until one day you look down and realize you're standing unarmed in the middle of enemy ground. Looking back, I can see the pattern so clearly. Daniel's friendliness had an expiration date. His laughter was the kind that always carried a hint of judgment underneath. And the HOA, his stage, gave him just enough power to play king in a kingdom of fences and flower beds. Still, I kept quiet. I kept quiet because after years of fighting in my marriage, of courtrooms and negotiations, I didn't think I had the strength to fight anymore. I wanted to believe that if I just worked hard enough, if I just painted and mowed and smiled politely, I could live unnoticed, untouched. But silence has a cost, and the cost is dignity. The night after I found the orange notice, I stood again by the fence in my backyard, my palm pressed against the same rough wood as the day I moved in. Except this time, instead of pride, I felt a tremor of shame. The boards were weathered, yes, but they still stood, strong like me. Yet in Daniel's eyes, in the eyes of the HOA he controlled, they were nothing but proof of neglect. It struck me then how fragile our reputations are. One man's words, one sheet of paper, and suddenly you're not a homeowner, you're a failure. You're not a neighbor, you're a nuisance. That night I whispered something to myself I hadn't said out loud in years. A promise, really. No more silence. The orange notice didn't stay alone for long. A week later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. Failure to comply with HOA standards, it read. This time the charge was a trip hazard on my walkway. I stared at the brick in question for 10 minutes, crouched low, running my fingers over its surface. It was barely uneven, less than half an inch raised above the others. Still, the letter claimed it was a safety risk. I sighed, grabbed at my tools, and reset the brick myself. The work took less than 20 minutes, but the fine remained, $250, due within 30 days. Then came another, my gutters, improperly draining. Another fine, then another, for excessive vegetation in the side yard, even though the weeds hadn't grown higher than my ankle. Each notice was like a slow drip of poison into my veins. By the third month, I had stacked them neatly in a drawer in the kitchen, each envelope identical in size and weight, their orange headers shouting the same thing. You are failing. At night, when I sat in the living room, I could hear the drawer almost breathing in the dark, a quiet reminder that I was losing control of the one place I thought was untouchable. It was around then that Daniel's comments became bolder. I'd be trimming hedges when he'd stroll by, glass of whiskey in hand though the sun was barely down, and say, "Hey, maybe you should call my guy for that. He's quick, not cheap, but quick. Would save you some of these headaches." Or when I was repainting the garage door, his voice floated across the street. "Hope you're using the right kind of primer. If not, HOA's going to eat you alive. Always with that half-smile, as though he were doing me a favor by reminding me of my inadequacy. And each time, I swallowed my words, my silence, again. But something inside me began to stir. Not anger, not yet, but suspicion. His comments weren't casual. They were too timed, too precise. The notices always seemed to follow shortly after I turned down one of his suggestions. It was as if my house had become his personal chessboard, and every refusal I gave him was a move he punished with another violation. One night I couldn't sleep. I'd been pacing the house, the smell of fresh paint still hanging in the air from the garage. The clock ticked past 1 a.m., then 2 o'clock. I found myself at the kitchen table staring at the drawer where the notices sat like stacked tombstones. I pulled them out one by one, laying them across the table. The repetition of language struck me feet. Erst Martin, the same phrasing, the same font, the same clipped tone. But it wasn't just that. At the bottom of each notice in fine print was a line I hadn't noticed before. Recommended contractor. See attached list. I flipped through. Sure enough, several notices came with a stapled page listing approved contractors. My eyes lingered on the names. One in particular appeared more than once. Northfield Repairs, LLC. Something about it stuck in my mind. I grabbed my laptop, opened the county business registry, and typed it in. It took longer than I expected. The site was clunky, like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. But there it was. Northfield Repairs. Registered under a residential address only 5 miles away. And the listed contact? Matthew Cross, Daniel's ex-wife's maiden name. My chest tightened. Coincidence? Maybe. But a rotten feeling gnawed at me. I dug further, pulling up county records, financial statements from the HOA. Buried in the minutes of a quarterly meeting was a line item, Emergency Property Repairs, $25,000. The contractor? Northfield Repairs. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the laptop reflecting in the window. My reflection stared back at me, pale and tight-jawed. My house was never unsafe. My fence wasn't rotting. My walkway wasn't a hazard. These weren't warnings. They were invoices, excuses to funnel money. Daniel wasn't protecting the neighborhood. He was feeding off it, feeding off me. I felt sick. I paced the living room, the floor creaking under my weight. My hands trembled as I tore open the rest of the notices, scattering paper across the rug. The words blurred together. Unsafe, hazard, non-compliance. It was all theatre, and I had been the fool in the starring role. The anger came slow, then all at once like a dam cracking. I slammed my fist against the table, the wood rattling. My throat burned, all too. Hose nights I'd swallowed my pride. All the hours I'd spent sanding, scraping, painting. None of it mattered. The game had been rigged from the beginning. I looked down at my hands, calloused and stained with paint, proof of every ounce of labor I had poured into this house. And still, they had branded me a failure. On the mantel, above the fireplace, sat a small framed photo of my father. He was in his work clothes, a plain shirt, grease smudged on his cheek, the same half-smile I used to think was unshakable. He'd been a mechanic, a man who fixed things with his bare hands, who taught me that if something was broken, you didn't complain, you didn't wallow, you fixed it. I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred. My father had died before he could see me buy this house, but I'd always felt like I was proving something to him by keeping it, by standing on my own 2 feet. And now I was letting another man strip it away piece by piece. No more, I muttered. My voice cracked. I picked up one of the notices, crumpled it tight in my fist, and threw it into the trash, then another, and another, until the orange was buried beneath coffee grounds and yesterday's paper. But I didn't feel relief. The hollow ache in my chest remained. because this wasn't over. This wasn't just about notices or fines. This was about control, about one man's arrogance, and my silence. I sank into the chair, head in my hands, and let the anger settle into something colder, sharper. I couldn't undo the months I'd lost, the humiliation I'd endured. But maybe, just maybe, I could stop it from happening again. The seed of resolve was small, almost fragile. But it was there, and it was enough. The next morning I woke with the same heaviness in my chest, yet beneath it, a flicker of something else, a whisper of my father's voice, a memory of his hands guiding mine across a wrench. Don't let bullies take what isn't theirs. For the first time in months, I looked at the fence not as a weakness, but as a line in the sand. And I swore to myself. Daniel had taken enough from me. It was time to stop being silent. I didn't storm into Daniel's yard. I didn't call the HOA president that night, nor did I fire off an email that could later be twisted against me. Instead, I went quiet. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my property before sunrise, dew still clinging to the grass. The fence, that old, leaning fence, stretched like a tired soldier around my yard, battered but holding. I ran my hand along the wood, the splinters catching against my palm. It had always been a symbol of division, of keeping others out. But now, I realized, it was also a symbol of what I still had control over. My ground, my boundary, my choice. I made a decision then. If Daniel was going to play his game loud and public, mine would be silent and deliberate. I started small. I cancelled the HOA's approved repairman list and found my own. I combed through local directories until I came across a carpenter named Luis. His reviews were modest, written in plain words, not the marketing gloss of fake testimonials. When he arrived in an old pickup, tools rattling in the back, I saw the same kind of calloused hands my father once had. "Looks like she's got good bones," Luis said, patting the fence like he was greeting an old friend. "Just needs someone to care for her." It was the first time in months someone had spoken about my home with respect, not accusation. My throat tightened. Together, we spent 3 weekends reinforcing the posts, sanding, staining. I learned to hold tools the way my father once taught me. Steady grip, patient movements. My palms blistered, bled, then hardened again. Each swing of the hammer was more than construction. It was reclamation. In the evenings, after Louis left, I'd sit on the porch with a beer and watch the wood darken under the fresh stain, the boards catching the last light of 2. He day. Daniel passed sometimes, his eyes narrowing, but I didn't wave. I didn't even look at him long enough to offer a reaction. Silence was its own weapon. But survival wasn't only about the fence. The stack of notices still haunted me, though now they sat hidden in a folder rather than scattered across the kitchen. I began tracking everything. Every expense, every repair, every conversation I overheard between Daniel and the HOA's board members at their smug little backyard gatherings. I took notes in a worn leather journal, the same one I'd once used to track my father's old repair lessons. The faint oil stains on its pages reminded me of Saturday afternoons in our garage, him handing me wrenches while teaching me patience. That book became my shield now, every line inked with dates, names, amounts. I didn't know what I'd do with the information yet, but writing it down gave me control. It turned chaos into order. Still, survival had a price. Isolation. Friends had stopped dropping by months ago, worried about parking tickets or fines from the HOA. My sister called less, her voice soft with pity every time she asked, "You doing okay?" I lied, of course. Told her the house was fine, that I was fine. But at night, the quiet pressed heavy against my chest. I filled it with work. I repaired the gutters myself, not because they were broken, but because I wanted to understand every inch of the house Daniel claimed was unsafe. I replaced light fixtures, oiled hinges, resealed windows. Every task was both an act of defiance and a way to stitch myself back together. One evening I found myself holding my father's photo again. His eyes seemed sharper now, less like a memory and more like a challenge. "I'm trying," I whispered. "I won't let him take this from me." By late summer, the house looked better than it had in years. The lawn was trimmed, the fence stood proud, the gutters gleamed in fresh paint. And me? I felt stronger, steadier, as though every nail I drove into the wood had been driven into my spine too. Daniel noticed. I caught him staring one afternoon, leaning on his mailbox with that same whiskey glass in hand. "Looks nice," he said, tone clipped. "Hope it's to code." I didn't answer, just kept sanding the porch rail until the dust coated my arms. The silence rattled him more than an argument ever could. But the real turning point came not from the house, but from a chance encounter. I was in the hardware store picking up replacement bulbs when a woman approached me near the paint aisle. Mid-40s, kind eyes, hair pulled back with streaks of silver. She hesitated before speaking. "You live on Cedar Ridge, right?" I nodded cautiously. She sighed. "We moved out last year. Couldn't take it anymore. The fines, the constant harassment. My husband thought it was just us. But—" She trailed off, eyes glancing toward the shelves. Something in her expression unlocked the truth I'd suspected. We weren't isolated cases. Daniel's game wasn't just with me. It was with anyone he thought he could squeeze. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "I heard he made money off it. Contractors, fake repairs. 20, maybe 30,000. We couldn't prove it. But—" Her words faded, as if speaking them out loud risked something. I thanked her quietly, the weight of her confession burning in my chest. That night, I wrote it down in my journal, underlined it twice. Not just me, not just paranoia. A pattern. Escape and survival weren't dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no sudden victories. It was slower than that, quieter. A rebuilding not just of wood and nails, but of my sense of self. I was still alone, yes. Still waking some nights with a pounding heart when I imagined another orange notice waiting in the mailbox. But the difference was this. I no longer saw myself as the victim of it. I saw myself as the keeper of a truth waiting to be uncovered. And deep down, I knew the quiet rebuild was only the beginning. Rebirth doesn't come all at once. It comes in fragments, like shards of glass scattered across the floor after a window breaks. You don't rebuild by replacing the whole pane at once. You do it by carefully collecting each shard, each fragment, and making sense of them. That's what the next few months became, a slow gathering of broken pieces. It began with the journal. The leather had softened under my hands, the corners frayed from being thumbed through night after night. What had started as messy notes, dates scribbled in frustration, quick reminders of overheard conversations, grew into something sharper, more deliberate. I organized the entries, created sections, fines, repairs, contractors, rumors. Each detail was cross-referenced with receipts, letters, photographs I'd begun to take. The house itself became evidence. Every time I finished a repair, I took photos, before and after. The gutters I'd resealed, the porch rails sanded smooth, the fence reborn with fresh stain. Each picture was time-stamped, proof that the work had been done, that the house had never been unsafe. Proof that the HOA's narrative was built on sand. And with each page, each photo, my fear began to loosen its grip. I wasn't just a man under siege anymore. I was building a case. The turning point came when I found my father's old filing cabinet in the garage. It had sat there for years, collecting dust and rust, filled with yellowed invoices from jobs he'd done decades ago. Inside, tucked between a stack of old repair manuals, I found something else. A black binder. It wasn't his. It was mine, from years ago, back when I first bought the house. Inside were the inspection reports, the original HOA welcome packet, even the minutes from the first community meeting I'd attended. Reading through them was like uncovering a time capsule. Back then, Daniel had been different. Or maybe I had just been blind. His name showed up on every committee. Landscaping, bylaws, finance. He'd been planting seeds of control from the start. One set of minutes caught my eye. A vote to approve emergency repair budgets that could be authorized by the HOA treasurer, Daniel. No second signatures required. The motion had passed quietly, buried under talk of holiday decorations and community barbecues. My chest tightened. That was the opening. That was how he funneled the money. The next weeks blurred into late nights of research. I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread like battle plans, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. I traced the contractors Daniel hired. Most were shell companies, names that led back to P.O. boxes or non-existent addresses. I compared dates. The fines I received always preceded a repair invoice paid by the HOA. The pattern was clear. But clarity wasn't enough. I needed proof that others could understand, proof that couldn't be dismissed as paranoia. So I started talking. It wasn't easy. Most neighbors were afraid to speak against Daniel. He had a way of making dissenters disappear. Not literally, but socially. One family who once questioned the rising HOA fees suddenly had their lawn cited for weeds, their mailbox out of compliance, their kids' bikes banned from the cul-de-sac. By the end of the year, they'd moved. But slowly, carefully, a few opened up. An older man down the street admitted he'd paid $5,000 for a mandatory roof inspection. But no one ever climbed onto his house. A young couple whispered about the fines that had eaten their savings, forcing them to delay their wedding. Each story echoed mine. Intimidation, financial bleed, silence. I wrote everything down, careful with dates and names. The journal grew thick, its pages swelling with ink. The leather cover became stained with fingerprints, coffee rings, even a smear of sawdust from the fence. It felt alive, like a beating heart carrying the pulse of every wrong Daniel had orchestrated. Through it all, the house transformed. The fence no longer sagged. It stood proud and straight, a soldier reborn. The porch rails gleamed with new varnish, catching sunlight in honey-colored streaks. Inside, the room smelled of fresh paint and oiled hinges. But more than the house, I transformed. The man who once shrank from Daniel's gaze now stood taller, shoulders squared. The shame that once burned my chest had cooled into something steadier. Resolve. I had been broken, yes, but like wood under pressure, I'd hardened. One night I stood at the fence line again. Daniel's house glowed with warm light, laughter spilling faintly from his back patio where guests sipped drinks. His world looked untouchable, smug, certain. But I knew different now. He wasn't untouchable. He was sloppy, greedy, overconfident, and I had the pieces of the puzzle he thought no one was sharp enough or brave enough to collect. The final piece came unexpectedly. I was at the county records office, flipping through permits and property filings, when I noticed a document signed in Daniel's name, a repair authorization for community fence replacement. The date caught my attention. It was issued 3 months earlier, supposedly for $25,000 worth of work. But the community fence? It hadn't been touched in years. I drove back, parked near the entrance, and walked the entire perimeter. Every post, every panel, the same weathered wood I'd seen since the day I moved in. Not a single repair. I took pictures of every stretch of fence, dozens of photos. Then I compared them to Google Street View images from years past. Identical. Daniel had filed for work that never happened, and pocketed the money. When I saw the figure again, $25,000, my chest burned. That was the same amount he'd mocked me with, the unsafe conditions repair bill he'd waved in my face. He'd stolen from all of us, while bleeding me dry as his scapegoat. Out that night, I sat at the table with the journal open, the photos spread out, the receipts neatly stacked. For the first time, the chaos formed a complete picture. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every neighbor he'd bled, every family forced out, every dollar pocketed. I felt something shift deep inside me. Not anger. Not the raw, consuming fire that had nearly broken me months before. No. This was cooler, sharper. It was power. I closed the journal, pressing my palm against the worn leather, and looked around the room. My house no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a fortress. Every repair, every nail, every stain of varnish had been training, preparing me for this. I wasn't the man Daniel thought he could bully into silence. I was the man who was going to end him. The cologne bottle sat on the shelf where I'd left it months ago, untouched. Once, it had symbolized my invisibility, the scent my ex-wife never noticed, the man I felt I had ceased to be. I picked it up, uncapped it, and let a faint mist spray into the air. The scent was sharp, familiar, grounding. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt undeniable. The evidence was ready. The journal was complete. The neighbors' whispers had become testimonies. All that remained was the confrontation, and I was ready for it. The morning of the HOA meeting, the air felt charged, the kind of thick electric stillness before a summer storm. I dressed carefully, not in my work clothes, not in the paint-smeared shirts I'd worn for months of repairs. Instead, I chose a crisp button-down pressed slacks, shoes polished until I could see my reflection. When I fastened the top button, my hands didn't tremble. I glanced once more at the table. The journal sat there, thick and heavy, its leather cover worn but proud. Next to it a neat stack of documents, photographs, ESEPs, permits, the paper trail of a man's lies. For months, Daniel had reduced me to shadows. Today, I would step back into the light. The community hall buzzed with low chatter when I arrived. Neighbors milled about, folding chairs scraping against the tile floor as people settled into their usual clusters. The smell of burnt coffee and powdered donuts lingered, but beneath it was something sharper, unease. Daniel stood at the front, framed by the American flag and the HOA banner. He wore his power like a tailored suit, greeting people with practiced smiles, shaking hands as if he were a benevolent king among subjects. His wife hovered nearby, passing out agenda sheets. When his eyes landed on me, a flicker crossed his face. A twitch, gone as quickly as it came. He nodded in acknowledgement, the kind of nod you'd give an insect you weren't quite sure how to squash. I took my seat near the front, journal and papers stacked in my lap. My heart beat steady. The meeting began with routine business, landscaping updates, trash collection schedules, an upcoming block party. People murmured, checked phones, scribbled on notepads. Daniel spoke smoothly, a man in total control of his stage. Then he cleared his throat and shifted the agenda. "Next item," he said, voice carrying with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. "The matter of property compliance, specifically," his eyes landed on me, "the ongoing violations at Mr. Carter's residence." A ripple went through the crowd. I felt eyes slide toward me. Curiosity, pity, some even satisfaction. The scapegoat on display. Daniel smiled thinly. As you know, the board has been patient, generous even. But despite repeated notices, fines, and opportunities for correction, Mr. Carter has failed to maintain safe and compliant conditions. As such, the board is moving to escalate enforcement measures, including potential lien proceedings. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang heavy. That was his mistake. I stood. Actually, I said, my voice clear, carrying across the hall, I think it's time we talk about compliance. Not mine. Yours. A hush fell. The scrape of chairs stopped. Daniel's smile faltered. I set the journal on the podium with a deliberate thud. The sound echoed like a gavel striking. For a moment, I simply let it sit there, my hand resting on the leather cover. Then I looked out at the crowd. My neighbors. People who had lived in fear of Daniel's fines, his notices, his intimidation. This, I said, tapping the journal, is the record of every lie, every fabrication, every dollar siphoned from this community under the guise of repairs and violations. Not just mine, yours too. A murmur rose, uneasy, questioning. Daniel laughed, forced, brittle. Let's not indulge conspiracy theories, Mr. Carter. If you'd like to contest your fines, there are proper channels. I opened the journal. The first photo I pulled was of my porch rail, dated before and after repair. Unsafe, I read aloud from one of his violation notices. Except this repair was completed months before you fined me. I held up the after photo, sharp and undeniable. Time-stamped, documented. The only thing unsafe was your paperwork. Another page, receipts from contractors. Here's a payment made for a community fence replacement. $25,000. I walked that fence. Photographed every inch. Not a single board was touched. I checked county records. No permits filed. No inspections. Where did the money go, Daniel? The room shifted. Neighbors leaned forward, brows furrowed, whispers swelling. I didn't stop. I laid out invoice after invoice, story after story. The older man who'd paid thousands for a phantom roof inspection, the young couple bled by mandatory landscaping fees, the family forced out after fines multiplied like weeds. With each page, the air thickened. The whispers turned into low gasps, mutters of recognition. Faces turned toward Daniel, no longer deferential but sharp, suspicious. Daniel tried to interject, but every time he opened his mouth, I cut him off with another document, another testimony, and then the binder. I held it high, the one I'd found in my father's cabinet, showing the minutes where Daniel had engineered the emergency fund loophole. This is how it started, I said. A single motion, buried in fine print. From that day, he had unilateral control, and he's been bleeding us ever since. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. I paid for that. He fined us too. That's why our dues went up. Daniel's face flushed crimson. This is slander, he spat, pounding the podium. Baseless accusations, fabrications by a bitter man who can't follow simple rules. I opened the final folder. County records, the community fence replacement contract, signed by Daniel himself. Photos of the untouched fence. Payment transfers to a shell company registered to his brother-in-law. I set them on the podium. The evidence lay there like a loaded weapon. This isn't bitterness, I said quietly. My voice cut through the chaos like a blade. It's truth. And you can't bury it anymore. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Daniel stood frozen, sweat glistening at his temples. For the first time, he didn't look like a king. He looked cornered, small. A neighbor spoke up, the older man, voice trembling with restrained anger. "I want an audit." Another voice. "So do I." Then another, and another. The chant spread until the entire hall rang with it. "Audit, audit, audit." Daniel's wife gathered the agenda sheets in shaking hands, her face pale. Daniel's jaw worked, but no words came. The storm had broken. In the days that followed, the board called an emergency session without him. An independent audit was ordered. Notices circulated quietly, almost sheepishly, to every homeowner. Daniel removed from position pending investigation. Neighbors who once averted their eyes when passing me now stopped to talk, to thank me, to share their own stories. It was as if a dam had burst, silence replaced by solidarity. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a beacon. One evening I stood on the porch, hands resting on the newly polished rail. The air was cool, scented with cut grass and faint lilac. For the first time in years, laughter drifted down the street. Not Daniel's laughter, sharp and cruel, but neighbors gathered together, voices warm, free. I lifted the journal in my hands. Its pages were worn, filled, complete. It had carried me through fire, through humiliation, through the slow burn of survival. I thought of my father, of his tools and the lessons hidden in their weight, of my ex-wife and the cologne bottle still resting on the shelf, no longer a symbol of invisibility, but of the man I'd become. I thought of the fence, once sagging, now strong, a reflection of myself. And I smiled. Daniel would face his reckoning in court, in audits, in the collapse of his carefully crafted facade. But for me, the reckoning had already happened. I had been broken, humiliated, forgotten, but I had rebuilt. And in that rebuild, I had found something Daniel could never take. Dignity, strength, the quiet, unshakable power of a man who had been to the bottom and risen, not louder, but stronger. That night, as I set the journal back on the shelf, I whispered to the empty room, "It's done." And for the first time in years, the silence that answered me felt like peace. The house no longer creaks the way it used to. Maybe it's the repairs, the replaced beams and tightened screws, or maybe it's me, the way I hear it now, less as complaint and more as character. Each sound feels earned, like the voice of something that has survived storms and still stands. The fence gleams in the morning light, straight and strong. Sometimes I rest my hand on the smooth wood, remembering the day I drove each nashut. Ale in with hands that shook but didn't stop. Back then it felt like defiance. Now it feels like continuity, like a line drawn between who I was and who I've become. Neighbors wave when they pass. Children ride their bikes past my driveway without the old hush of caution. One of them even shouted the other day, "Nice garden," when I was kneeling in the soil, hands dirty, sweat on my brow. A simple thing, but it landed in me like sunlight through a window. Daniel is gone. His name still floats in conversation sometimes, in whispers, in unfinished sentences. But it carries no power anymore. He is a story people tell with lowered voices, a lesson etched into the memory of the community. The audit revealed everything I suspected, and more. Money siphoned, rules bent, lives quietly crushed under the weight of his greed. He will answer for it in courts and ledgers, in the shame of exposure. That part isn't mine to carry anymore. What is mine is here. The journal rests on the shelf, its cover faded from months of handling. I haven't opened it in weeks. I don't need to. It's there, a reminder of the fire I walked through and the evidence I brought to light. But its purpose has shifted. It isn't a lifeline anymore. It's a relic, like my father's tools, like the cologne bottle on the dresser. Symbols of survival, markers of the man I've become. Sometimes I catch the faintest trace of that cologne when I open the closet, even though the bottle has been empty for years. I used to hate the smell, the way it reminded me of absence and betrayal. Now, when it drifts past, I think of resilience. How even in emptiness, something can linger, strong and undeniable. I don't hate the past anymore. I don't hide from it either. It happened. It broke me. But it also built me again, sharper, steadier. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands. The sun set slow, streaking the sky in colors I hadn't noticed in a long time. Violet bleeding into gold, clouds rimmed in fire. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the Österschid, the shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing. I was simply here, alive. I thought about my father, about the calluses on his hands, about the quiet way he worked without fanfare or applause. He used to say, "A good repair holds even when no one's watching." I think I finally understand what he meant. This house, this fence, this community. They're standing because I refuse to crumble. But the real repair was inside me. The kind no one sees, the kind that doesn't get photographed or documented, the kind that holds. As the sky darkened, a breeze moved through the trees, rattling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like applause. I let it wash over me, let the quiet settle into my bones. For so long, silence had been my enemy. Now, it was my companion. Not emptiness, not absence. Peace.